I'll leave my cigarette until a reward for when. I thought that I would read something about this is from a book that I wrote some time ago. Never reprinted it. It won the leading prize in America, the James Beard Award, for the best drinks book of the year, whichever the year was. It was about 2005, I think. But anyway, it's never been. This is a message to my publisher, by the way, to reprint it.
Well, it's funny. The reason we were this book came up in the first place was actually we had a blog a while back, and I interviewed Nick Morgan about his book recommendations, and one of the books he had. Now, I don't know if this is going to work, but let's just have a quick while you light up. No, it probably won't let me do it. But on one of the books that he recommended was of a must read in terms of historical.
Oh well, coming from
this
Dr.
exact
Morgan,
one.
I'm so kind. That's very generous of him.
So there it began. So that was the reason I read it in the first place. And actually,
there we are.
It's so good that we asked you to read something.
Well, that's very kind of you. Well, if I could reciprocate to Nick, I have literally 2 days ago, I wrote a review of his forthcoming, what's just about to appear at the end of this month, his History of Johnny Walker, which is absolutely brilliant. I think I'm going to give up writing because he knows so much more than I do, and he writes so elegantly that it's a really.
And he's doing an exclusive book reading. So the first book reading of that book will be on Wednesday. So hopefully he'll come and visit us for that one as well.
When's that going to be broadcast?
So it'll be Wednesday here.
Wednesday.
6 o'clock.
I'll be there.
And just before we go on, we've got on Monday we've got Henry Jeffreys reading from Empire of Booze.
I don't know that book yet.
On Thursday we've got Rachel McCormack reading from.
Oh, great! Yes, yeah.
So,
Rachel's great. She's got a lovely speaking voice, and
as you've been sort of Scotland's leading whiskey writer for around 40 years, I think I'm going to go quiet now and let you read. What I say to anyone who's listening, so that you don't have to watch my face all the way through this, is double click on Charlie MacLean's face, and his screen will go bigger, and I'll just be in the background. But I'm just going to go in silence.
Great. Well, I'm going to try and keep my reading short because we're so late in starting, I'm afraid.
Fine. Everyone came here for you rather than, so don't worry about it. Just relax and do your reading.
Yeah.
And then at the end, I've got a few questions.
And then we'll have questions. I love the questions. I prefer to be in questions than reading.
Okay.
So this is a history of Scotch whisky, and I'm going to focus on the section. The subtopic is the chapter is Whisky 1980s to 1994, and the subsection is called the Renaissance of Single Malts, which I hope might be of interest to some of the viewers. In 1930, Inez MacDonald bitterly lamented the demise of malt whisky. Inez MacDonald's wonderful book, which is my Desert Island whisky book, by the way, which is simply called Scotch, I think, and it's a polemic against blended Scotch whisky. So he lamented the complete demise of malt whisky. He says, the notion that we can possibly develop a palate for whisky is guaranteed to produce a smile of derision in any company except that of a few Scottish lads, farmers, gamekeepers, and bailies, relics of a vanished age of gold when the vintages of the North had their students and lovers. Isn't that beautiful? He would have been happy. He would have been a happy man had he lived to see the growth in consumer interest in malt whisky during the 1980s. Truly a phenomenon of the age, and one which has given new life to Scotch in the traditional markets. And then I refer to in the last chapter, we saw how a few independent companies began to set aside parcels of malt whisky, notably William Grant's, MacLean, Glenmorangie. Some of the independents like White and Mackay, were setting aside whiskies which they were going to produce and bottle as single malts, and to allocate budgets for promoting them. Total sales of single malt whisky accounted for less than 1% of the world market for Scotch in 1978. However, demand grew faster than the industry anticipated, both at home and abroad. In 1980, a symposium of whisky companies estimated that exports of single malts should rise by 8 to 10% over the next 5 years. In fact, the growth was twice that and subsequently has remained steady at around 10%. A measure of the popular interest in malt whisky is the number of books published on the subject during this period. Almost twice as many books on Scotch whisky appeared between 1980 and 2000, and at that time I estimated around 110 titles, as had been published in the previous 300 years. The first consumer, well, I won't go into that. During the 1980s, this trickle of books became a steady flow, and during the 1990s, a torrent. Leading titles included Michael Brander's Scotch Whisky, Colin Bell's Scotch Whisky, Neil Wilson's Scotch and Water, 1985, Michael Jackson's, of course, World Guide to Whisky, 1987, Wallace Milroy's Malt Whisky Almanac, first published in 86, then Michael Jackson's Malt Whisky Companion, which first appeared in 1989 and has been revised and updated 4 times. The first magazine devoted to Scotch, Whisky Time, appeared in December 1986 in Italy, edited by a man called Carmelo Barletti. Independent whisky companies responded by bottling their malts for the first time. Sorry, I just need to turn this. My sons are defying all the lockdown rules. We're having a party, or dinner party. Where were we? Independent whisky companies responded by, let's say, independent as opposed to the distillers company, which is now Diageo, the big one, and bottling their malts for the first time or increasing their exposure by repackaging and limited advertising. J&B launched Knocando in 1978 as a 12-year-old with stated vintages. Highland Park, Tamdhu and Bunnahabhain were repackaged by Highland Distillers and relaunched in late 1979, and Highland Park rapidly took off. Possibly the most elegant repackaging of all was that for the Balvenie by William Grant & Sons in 1982. Now named Founders Reserve, without an age statement, it was filled into a long-necked vintage cognac bottle, unlike any other Scotch. Abelard began to be heavily promoted in France around 1980. Blah, blah, blah. And actually, I wrote this. A lavish booklet was produced in 1983 by Long John International to promote Tormore in the USA. I wrote that. Well, actually, whatever, Karen. Glengarry was repackaged by Stanley P. Morrison around the same time, as was Auchentoshan. Bell's made Blair Athol, Inchgower, Bladnoch, and Dufftown widely available for the first time. So you'll see this, mainly the independent companies. It should be said that the advertising for both malts and blends, and the latter, of course, continued to consume the lion's share of budgets, continued to position their products with reference to the past as traditional and original, having heritage and character. Few advertisements showed any imagination or creativity. Almost all simply featured a bottle and a glass with the occasional Scottish landscape or skiscape or background, and sometimes a hint of tartan. It was awareness advertising designed to keep the brand in the mind of the consumer rather than promotional advertising, which tried to win new customers. The only exceptions were Macallan and Glenmorangie. The first employed tongue-in-cheek narrative and humour. The second stressed the craft elements in malt whisky making, culminating in the long-running 16 Men of Cain campaign. Both those whiskies were really launched in 1981, and indeed both those campaigns were from the same advertising agency in London, Holmes Knight Ritchie. Different creative teams, but astonishing. Sorry, this is an aside, but Macallan had been, it was ranked as a top class blending malt, filling malt, and a certain amount, a small amount, was bottled from way back, mainly by Gordon and MacPhail and Campbell, Hope and King in Elgin. And these, of course, are now fetching eye-watering prices at auction. But they appointed their first, well, they didn't really call them marketing directors, but effectively marketing director, a chap called Hugh Metcalfe. In 1978, Macallan. He'd come from Glengrant, and the Macallan's, astonishingly enough, Macallan's entire promotional budget for the brand Macallan in 1978 was £50. £50, can you imagine? Obviously, they'd been setting aside stock to bring the brand to market, and hence employed Hugh to run the marketing campaign, which of course it took off immediately in 1981. But it's a reminder of just how things change. So in 1982, Tony Lord, editor of Decanter magazine and author of the World Guide to Spirits in 1979, wrote in a supplement to Decanter, as recently as 10 years ago, only about 30 malts could be bought as singles. But fortunately, the rapidly increasing appreciation of single malts for their individual character has seen this number nearly double. If the giant Distillers Company Limited, which controls 45 of the malt distilleries, were more disposed to offering them as singles, then the range would be even greater. At the moment, though, it is the independent distillers who we are to thank for the greater number of malts on the market. In this, which was described as the largest tasting guide to single malt whiskies ever published, the panel of experts tasted 137 malts from 102 distilleries, a significant advance on the 30 available 10 years before. However, most were bottled by Gordon and MacPhail, not by the distillery owners, and almost all were very difficult to find. In 1982, DCL launched the Ascot Malt Cellar. Ascot was the company's home trade base, a collection of 4 singles and 2 vatted malts, which was to be the forerunner of the later classic malts selection. These original ones were Rosebank, 8 years old, Linkwood, 12 years old, Talisker, 8 years old, Lagavulin, 12 years old, Strathconnan, a Buchanan's vatted malt, and Glenleven, a Haig's vatted malt. By all accounts, this was done reluctantly and was not widely promoted. It made no impact on the marketplace, but the idea of exploring different styles and regional differences was there, and this would be widely exploited in years to come. Shall I carry on a tiny bit more? I'll read the next little section, which is entitled Regional Differences. As many of you may know, well, I'll read and then explain. In 1988, the Distillers Company's successor, United Distillers, that was when DCL had been taken over by Guinness, launched a range of 6 malts on the market which stressed regional differences and opened up the whole sector. The company had huge resources of mature whiskey to draw from. Malts were upmarket, high value, and high profile. It then used its extensive portfolio to take the sector a stage further. It decided to try the Ascot Malt Cellar approach again, albeit with a difference of emphasis, launching 6 single malt whiskies as a set, in marketing terms, as a single product, although of course they could be bought separately, and selecting them in a way which would demonstrate the differences between malts made in one region and another. Regional differences in flavour had been noted by writers since at least the 1930s. They had historical precedents in the ancient division between Highland and Lowland. The Highland line was drawn in 1780-81, and the later classification of Islay and Campbelltown. For modern consumers familiar with wine regions, Speyside only came much later, by the way. It was only in the 1890s that Speyside took off, and then it became, of course, a region, and the most important region in its own right. For modern consumers familiar with wine regions, regional differences in malt whisky were comprehensible, made malts more accessible, and most important, encouraged exploration. From their huge inventory of available whiskies, United Distillers selected 6 and named them the classic malts. They were Lagavulin and Talisker, representing the peated style of Islay and the slightly less smoky style of the Isles. Oban, maritime in character, representing the West Highlands. Dalwhinnie, a typical Highland malt. Cragganmore, a complex Speyside, and Glenkinchie, the dryish lowland style. All are the product of small, traditional, picturesque distilleries. The company had in mind the fact that consumers might want to visit the distilleries. This is another aspect that sort of was growing at the time, the idea of opening distilleries to the public. The malts were, and they soon developed visitor facilities at each site. The malts were bottled at ages which it was deemed showed their characteristic best, their character best, between 10 and 16 years, and were handsomely repackaged, each in a different shaped bottle with a different style of label. It was an intelligent and appropriate move, and was highly successful. Other distillers attempted to follow suit, but less successfully. Allied distillers introduced the Caledonian malts in 1991, featuring Tormore, Milton Duff, both from Speyside, Glendronach, Aberdeenshire, and Lefroy from Islay. Later, Scapa from Orkney joined that set and replaced Tormore. In 1994, Seagram offered the Heritage Selection, Longmorn, Glenkeith, Strathyla, and Benriach. All good malts, but all from Speyside, and having a broadly similar flavour profile. Both projects were abandoned. I think I'll leave it there just now. It would be nice to get on to some questions.
Charlie, that was marvellous. So just for
it's not too boring.
not for us though. So those of you who arrived halfway through, we asked Charlie to read from his marvellous book published in 2003, Scotch Whisky: A Liquid History. No longer available in all good bookshops, but is available quite occasionally, let's say at Whisky.Auction in the books and memorabilia auctions. So there were a few questions that sort of cropped up while you were reading from my part. So I was going to just ask you, I wanted to start just asking about the process. A lot of the discussion over this week will be about the process of making whiskey and about the process of tasting whiskey. But my question is more about the process of writing a book about whiskey. There's two questions. One is the process of writing a proper book about whiskey, and there's so many books about with lists, but this is a proper history book about whiskey. Was it difficult to get it published? What were the complexities of writing such a thing?
Well, I'm afraid I don't write speculatively. All the books I've written 18 books now on Scotch whisky, and all of them have been commissioned, and so I don't write speculatively. The first one was commissioned in 1988. I started to write about whisky commercially, i.e., as a commercial, as a copywriter, in 1981. And by 1988, so this I need to correct myself, because I did pitch an idea for a whisky book to Mitchell Beasley, a publisher in London, in '88, because by that time I had become very, very interested in the subject, and B, had a sufficient track record in writing about whisky for numerous whisky companies and brands to make a fist of a proposal for a book. But that was the first one. So then after that, I was approached by publishers to write about this, that, and the next thing at one angle or another. And the early ones were generally introductory things. And then the Mitchell Beasley came back to me in '97, I think it was, and or it was because it takes time to write a book, probably about '94, '95, and commissioned a book called Malt Whisky, which was a much more detailed book, and thereafter, that's how it happened from me. Not my floating ideas to them, but they coming to me saying we want a book about X, Y, and Z. And indeed, I've given up writing sort of entry-level books, and whiskey writers are by and large very friendly with one another, and we share ideas, and we share, if we want information, we speak to one another, and so these titles I pass on to somebody else who might prefer to do it rather than I.
You started off as a publisher, though, didn't you?
I'm sorry?
You started off as a publisher?
No, I started off as a literary agent. Well, I started off, for goodness sake, if you want to go right back, my first degree was in art history from St Andrews University, and then I did a law degree in Dundee, which I finished in Edinburgh University, and I qualified as a solicitor in Edinburgh, and rapidly knew that the law was not for me, and so set up a company actually as a literary agent in Edinburgh in 1977, with the then a junior lecturer in law, but now the extraordinarily famous author Alexander McCall Smith, who was the chairman of the company, and I was the managing director of the company, and there was no other members, so there was nobody else working for us. So, but I got out of the law in 78, I would think 78, I would guess, as soon as I'd qualified, and went to literary agency, promptly starved, but then started to originally ghostwriting. So publishers would phone and say, have you got any authors on your books who could help so-and-so to write a book about such and such? And by that time I had a business partner, and so we would say, well, we'll do it. And then in 1980, a cousin of mine who had been working in London in advertising as an account director, came to Edinburgh, and he worked for an incredibly creative agency, advertising agency, but they didn't have an in-house copywriter, which is, of course, most unusual. So we effectively became the copywriters for this Mar Associates, this agency, and indeed it was through them that the very first little booklet that I wrote, pamphlet, was for Bells, but the first significant job was for, as I say, for Tormore, for the American market, for Tormore, and that would be 82, I would guess. So then it was commercial copywriting was the main. The agency continued. I now had somebody to run that day to day, and and by this time I was writing books on the back burner, Scottish non-fiction, so books about castles, clans, tartans. Again, words for cash, and and then that took me into writing about whiskey.
And you've written a lot about. I've got a question here from one of my colleagues, but you've written a few books about blends. So those have been through the brands themselves.
No.
So the question that I've got here, when you answer that as well, is do you think that younger whiskey drinkers, or those who have discovered whiskey more recently, often overlook blended whiskey and the skills involved in the blending of malts in favour of single malts and single cask whiskies?
Yeah, that seems to be the way. I mean, this bit that I read, this segment that I read, it was called The Renaissance of Malt Whiskey. To some degree, the rediscovery, if you like, the renaissance of malt saved the day, because by the early 80s, blended Scotch, which had enjoyed huge success since the end of the war, I mean, it was the drink of the free world. you know, I mean, the UK market was the lead, and then the leading export market was, of course, America, but then very rapidly, France, Germany, and Italy came on board, and then slightly later, Japan, and so on. And of course, the imperial markets like Australia was, well, Australia had been the leading export market until about 1939. But so the demand for blended Scotch immediately after the war was immense, so much that as soon as money was available, and indeed, well, first grains available, but as soon as money was available, the whiskey companies expanded distilleries, modernized distilleries, centralized maltings, all the development that took place in the 60s and into the 70s, in the expectation that this huge climb in demand would continue. Alas, it lasted. There was a hiccup in the late 70s, which became a catastrophe by about 1980, 81, in that there was massive overproduction. Demand had crashed. Vodka, white rum, Bacardi particularly, and wine eroded both and also in the home market in the UK tax, ridiculous levels of taxation on spirits, and we are, heavens above, a spirit producing nation as opposed to wine producing nation, and breaks were given to so wine was not taxed at the same rate at all. And so the key thing really was that in the US and in the UK, Scotch, blended Scotch, was now perceived as being dad's drink, or indeed even grandpa's drink, you know. So it had lost the cachet that it once had. Now, so then then malt whiskey came in and sort of, to some extent, saved the day. I mean, we're still talking about, I mean, I would guess around 12%, between 10 and 12%, only 10 and 12% of the malt whiskey made is bottled as single malt. The rest all goes into blend. So don't underestimate the importance of blended Scotch. But malt whiskey contributes about 35% to the profitability of the industry, and so it's now a very very important sector.
I've got an excellent question here, and I'm going to rephrase it slightly and it's from Siddharth Soka. Sorry for my pronunciation. He's saying that you mentioned the classic malts in your more recent book, and he's asking why Balvenie isn't one of the classic malts. Now, are you talking about in the more recent book? Are you talking about the classic malts, the Diageo classic malts, or is this a more general term of?
Oh no. I mean, the classic malts was a very clever brand chosen by United Distillers. It's not. There are many other whiskies which might be referred to as classic malts. Indeed, the blenders used to rate them top class, first, second, third class, maybe first, second, third, fourth class, and then all the others, and then grain whiskies. So you might say that any of these ones which blenders, they had their own systems, but any of the top class ones might be regarded as being classic malts. No, it's a brand name. The classic malts.
And then I'm going to ask.
So I was referring.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask you another question from here. This is from Alexei Neronov. And he's asking if before regional differences could attract more customers to try whiskey from different regions to promote single malt consumption. He's wondering if you think that now there's a stigma around regions, and that could be more noxious.
I think I get the idea as well. He's right in the sense that it's not so much noxious or stigma, but the industry is moving away from regional differences as a way of introducing malt whiskies to consumers. The reason for this is that now there are there are smoky whiskies being produced on Speyside, and there are, well, always have been, non-peated whiskies produced on Islay. And so to identify Islay as famous for its smoky whiskies, Lagavulin, Ardbeg, Laphroaig, etc., Kalila, is somewhat, and so what the industry's view now is that they would rather rely on the consumer to make up their own mind. So they would rather guide them by flavor than by regional difference, which is fine and completely justifiable, but the regional idea and the flavor differences between regions are a useful way in, you know. And so if a retailer is displaying their whiskies, it's more useful it's easier, should I say, to do it by region than it is by flavor profile. Very difficult to categorize whiskies by flavor profile. You know, but yeah, you're right in the sense that there is generally a move away from regions, although they do have historical provenance, and they're useful. Publishers love it because how do you divide up a book? You divide it up by regions and so on.
And it does satisfy that collector mentality of trying to, if you want to taste every whiskey and every style, it's nice to have them all categorized in some way, isn't it?
Well, it is, and of course, if you like a particular style of whiskey, say, I mean, the most obvious would be a smoky Islay style. Then you look for whiskies in that from that region. You know, if you want, even though you might find whiskies within that region which don't have the character that you admire. But it's a useful tool, but not by any means infallible.
So that's sort of it's an awkward segue, but I did want to ask you about the pillaged malt. So your sons, you've got 3 sons who've rowed
the Atlantic, yeah.
The Atlantic, which is extraordinary, in the fastest time. Was it the fastest time ever?
Fastest time ever in a 3-man boat. It's the fastest by 6 days, by the way.
It's utterly extraordinary. Okay, so they've done that, and then on their return, they've bottled up a whiskey, pillaged whiskey. So this there is a connection. So was that how did they assemble that whiskey? The reason I became aware of it actually was because it's someone bought one and then resold it on the auction for charity.
Oh, good.
So that's where I became aware of it.
Oh, great.
So what exactly did they do? How did they create this whiskey?
Well, the whole row was done for charity, and they had 2 charities. One was called Feedback Madagascar, which essentially digs wells in Madagascar, which is the 4th poorest country in the world or something. And they're desperately poor, and a lot of the deaths, a lot of child deaths, baby deaths, are down to dirty water. So this charity exists to dig wells and produce clean water for the people. My youngest son, he was in Madagascar a couple of years ago now, but became aware of this, and so got in touch with the charity, and the director of the charity, who's a wonderful fellow called Jamie Spencer, who lives in Argyll, and OBE, by the way, he's in his 30s, you know, and he came up with this idea, the suggestion that they have a sort of the brand should be whiskey for water, you know, and so I then wrote to my friends in the industry on the West Coast, because they were going to do Jamie organised a trial row, a test row, when they had their boat up the West Coast, 300 miles, visiting all the distilleries up the West Coast. But actually, I'd written to them previously and said, "Look, this is the deal. would you be prepared to donate some bottles which will be blended together and sold for this charity for Feedback Madagascar? And so the boys did the row. They didn't actually raid and steal but it was the pillage idea was based upon as some of you may be aware, the Lagavulin, inspired by Lagavulin distillery, in I think about 2004, something like that, to row round Isla and gather pillage whiskey from the Isla distilleries, and then vat it up, a vatted malt, and then sell the bottles for charity, for local charities on the island. And so that was where pillage came from. And then some friends of theirs, friends of my boys, the boys are all in their 20s, and who are also the same sort of age, and they have a film production company in Glasgow called Lost Clock, and they filmed a lot of it and then made this beautiful little film called The Great Whisky Pillage, which is on the boys' website, on the BROAR, BROAR. It's hilarious, and it was apparently supposedly about stealing whiskey from the distilleries. But the industry was hugely generous. God, if I can reach it.
There's a question here about what do the pillaged bottles taste like?
It tasted remarkably good, actually. But all sold out, I'm afraid. Well, I'm glad to say. But the total donation was 380 bottles, and out of that, I assisted by Keir Sword and Arthur Motley from Royal Mile Whiskies, and by Alex Bruce from Adelphi and Ardnamurchan Distillery. We sat down and we looked at all these, and we wanted to create a vatted malt, a blended malt. And then William Grants very generously, thanks to the good offices, donated as much grain whiskey from Girvan Distillery, also West Coast, as we required to make a blended Scotch. And so the first one was called Pillage, and that achieved 166 bottles, and then spillage, shall I say? So there was pillage, the blended malt, and spillage, the blended Scotch, and with the Girvan grain added, and that was 553 bottles. And I got one. This is the only thing that I got was this type. This is spillage, and this is a mini, of course, but but it was very difficult because we didn't want it to be dominated by smoke, especially the pillage to be dominated by smoke. And of course we had hugely generous donations. I mean, you know, I'm looking at my list here. 30 bottles of Lagavulin 16 years old, 24 Ardbeg 10, 25 Talisker, 24 Ledgeg, etc. And you couldn't just string them all together because you'd get an overall extremely dominated whiskey, dominated by phenols, by smoke and so on. So we selected the proportions of whiskey to go into pillage, and then the rest was blended together with the grain in proportion. We worked it out. I can't remember now what it was now. 40% grain and 60% malt in the blend. And I'm happy to say that they sold very well, and indeed ultimately raised. Well, the boys for their other charity was called Children First, a Scottish charity, and they raised £250,000 for these charities, which is quite a considerable achievement.
Okay, so then talking of raising money, let's give you a scenario here. So obviously we're at Whisky.Auction and we sell whiskies. You may not be aware that we sell memorabilia and books as well. So I wanted to give you a scenario. The mafia are after you. You need to raise some money quickly. What from your collection would you sell to raise cash fast?
I don't have a collection, Isabel.
Yes,
I'm afraid
everyone
that
tells me that.
yeah.
No one likes to admit.
I will tell you a story though. I had a good friend who had a small collection, but it was a very high level collection. And he came up to see. He's based in London, and he came up to see me. And he was going to sell some of these bottles through Bonhams, and so he came up for the sale. And the night before, he was photographing the bottles, and he had a bottle of a unique bottle from a Campbelltown distillery called Whisky.Auction. And he put it up on a pile of books on the kitchen table, and to take a photograph, and the bloody thing fell off and broke. And he scraped up as much as he could, which he then gave to me. Now, I don't know if you can see. Can it?
Yeah.
That's the photograph of the label, Whisky.Auction.
Okay.
1895. The distillery closed in 1930. No, I beg your pardon. It's not Whisky.Auction. It's Dallaruan, which closed in 1920.
Okay.
And that was all that was left. And and I opened it actually online for some promotion thing for the Scotch whisky experience. And I tell you, it was absolutely extraordinary whiskey. It really was. Most unlike anything I've ever tasted.
In what way?
It was perfumed. Campbelltown whiskies were famously variable. They were all over the place. But this one was incredibly floral. It was the most remarkable thing. I'm not necessarily saying that it was that pleasant, but what an experience. And
There's a question here. Would you say it's perfumed like a 1980s Beaumont?
No, that's called FWP. We call it FWP, French horse perfume. This was much more elegant. This was more like rose petals. It was a more elegant sort of perfumed. But those famous Beaumonts, which of course the company denied altogether that the FWP was in there, but it was, and some people absolutely loved it. I mean, loved it. I don't have any valuable whiskies in my collection. I did have actually which I did sell, as a matter of fact. It was the first edition of the proprietary bottling of Port Ellen, 2001, when it was released, and the RRP I was given as a present, but the RRP then was £95, and you'll be able to tell me what the first edition of Port Ellen currently sells for. A couple of £1,000, 2,500.
It peaked out at sort of 3,000 or 4,000, and then it sort of settled down a bit. But yeah, it's
there we are. Yeah. So I mean, it is. I mean, the whole business and well, you're better qualified than I to talk about this, but really since 2008, I would date it from where stock markets went flat, and people with money were looking for alternative investments, and whiskey has risen until it is now rated, well, by the Knight Frank Wealth Report, for example, as the #1 best investment, alternative investment. And as a result, of course, the market has been slightly corrupted, because people who are not remotely interested in whiskey, they don't know anything about it, but they just know that they see the appreciation at auction and buy, and they've got very deep pockets, these chaps, and so it prices a lot of whiskies, not all whiskies, but certain makes beyond the reach of consumers and collectors. And but then of course so then the consumers and collectors are looking for sort of below the leading. Obviously, MacLean is the leading one, Dalmore, Bowmore to some extent, Isla whiskies to some extent. But as I say, you're more expert than I on this. But the
well, I always think it's frustrating when you get priced out of a whiskey that you dearly love, but there's always an underrated whiskey coming through, and there's always something else coming through, and it just takes more work. So it does rewards the experimental taster, and just
well, you're
you can go
absolutely
for the £100,000 bottles, but you don't have to.
yeah,
There
no,
are
that's absolutely right. And in the old days, before the investors started coming in, a lot of the collectors, let alone consumers, based their choice on flavor, and it would go around. The word would go around, and particularly since social media, the flavor. And there are a number of bottlings, millennial bottlings, 2000, which the word went around, they weren't that good, and they're probably still lying around, But so, yes, the wise buyer at auction, I think, who's not buying primarily as an investment, looks to whiskies. Rarity, obviously, is always a selling point, but flavor is the key thing. Flavor, the reputation of that particular bottling, which is shared amongst collectors and so on. And there are some which are remarkably good, and which well, and cheap at, well, relatively at auction or even retail,
I think it's interesting. You were mentioning the sort of the investment aspect of whiskey, and how it's attracting because of the stories in the press about whiskey is a great alternative investment, so that in itself attracts more investors who aren't the traditional market.
Yeah.
And that keeps that going and perpetuates that. But I remember when I was working at a wine broker and setting up the spirits department there, and I was talking to someone who'd worked in the financial markets before, and he was astonished that you could get so much advice on what to buy in terms of wine and whiskey entirely free of charge. Whereas if it was financial advice, you would have to pay a lot of money to get that same level of advice. So it was a really interesting take, and it was like, well, how do you trust the advice you're given? Well, you just have to go on their experience and your experience of their experience. But it was an interesting take.
No,
and
but the whole of the industry is based upon sharing. There's an awful lot of help, throughout the industry, and whether it's collectors or people wanting advice, or distilleries who a piece of equipment breaks down and they phone their neighbor competitor, and they'll come and help, and they'll replace the thing, whatever. It's an awful lot of it is to do with help and sharing and so on. And it's not entirely, avaricious, I mean, the heavens above. I mean, I know that, I and my colleagues give vast amounts of free help and information as best we can. And indeed, I love these sort of, I get almost daily, I get sort of historical questions from people who have a bottle of whiskey, and you'll be the same, I'm sure. And they want to, have you heard of this, and what do you know about it, and blah, blah, blah. And I mean, I've phoned you in the past, I'm sure, and certain Martin Green at Bonhams and so on, or Dr. Morgan, and to help these guys, identify the whiskey, appreciate it more, whatever,
So we've been talking about how the prices of whiskies have evolved over time. There's a few questions. There's a bit of a thread of questions here about how do you feel your palate has evolved over time? So you've been writing about whiskey for we're saying almost 40 years. It's
Yeah,
39 years.
yeah.
Do you feel your palate has changed over that time?
That's a very interesting question. You know, I did a formal training in the sensory evaluation of potable spirits with Pentlands, which is now the Scotch Whisky Research Institute, in 1992, 93, and that changed my life altogether. So I learned about the whole business of smelling and tasting and so on, and how to describe, flavor, and how my palate has changed. Well, I think that I try to be as objective as I can when I'm writing a tasting note. Now, you can never rule out subjectivity, but I try to be as analytical as I can, certainly initially, and then I might try and embellish. So, for example, if I'm smelling, say I'm smelling fruity, that's a broad category, and then I think, am I looking at fresh fruit, tinned fruit, dried fruit, cooked fruit, etc.? Am I looking at apples, pears, mangoes? So I'll try and break it down and to be more precise. But I'm trying to be as objective as I can. And there's no question about this. Is why I never go public on scores. So I'm trying to take out the subjectivity. I may not like this particular whiskey very much, but that is irrelevant. I'm not, it's not because somebody else might like it very, whatever.
And I think that's something so unique to whiskey, isn't it? That there is such subjectivity. There's obviously art and wine. People have subjective opinions about the quality of a work, but broadly speaking, there is a qualitative scale as well. And I think with whiskey, I'm astonished at how wide a range of whiskies that I might consider to be, in fact, faulty are actually adored by another type of palate. It's and that doesn't seem to
Well, you see, I mean,
happen.
think of Campbelltown whiskies. Think of Springbank and Glen Scotia. Now, I would generally the word that I would reach for, which is the if you like the overall descriptor for these, is grubby. They're kind of, they're not clean, but they are adorable. They are absolutely adorable, and with bags of character. And so the scale of, but you see, I think you have to bear in mind. I always have to bear in mind that the whiskey it's made as, it's not if the maker is doing a good job, it's bottled as they want it to be. Now there are obviously certain financial constraints, and there are always accountants lurking in the background. But so some are disappointing, and some I think are overpriced, and but that's not my job. My job is just to look at the liquid and to describe it as best I can, possibly to damn it with faint praise, to be coldly analytical, and then of course to be much more enthusiastic, if so subjectively enthusiastic, if I happen to like it particularly. And then, then if I'm asked to write a comment, that would come into the comment. But the tasting note, the appearance, the aroma, the taste, and the overall flavor is. I try to be as objective as possible. And as I say, I never reveal, if I possibly can, I never reveal I'll score privately, and if I'm chairing a panel, I'll always get the panel to mark it out of 10. I work out of 10. I can't bother with this. The IWSC sort of 100 score and so on. Too complicated. But I'll never go public on scores. And
so there's a question here. Do you think scoring is detrimental to whiskey as a whole, or beneficial? Do you think it has effect, or is it just
well, it makes it easier for it's a shortcut for consumers who don't really know very much about it. Look at Robert Parker and his scores for claret Bordeaux wines. And he has life and death over vintages, and if they don't score sort of 96 to 98, well, it's hardly worth even bottling. I mean, and I think that's iniquitous, really, because well, I don't know the wine industry like you do, but you assume that the winemaker, and I know that the whiskey maker, goes to huge lengths to develop the flavors that they want in their particular whiskey, and indeed, if it's to repeat it consistently, for whether it's a blend or malt whiskey, so that there is a consistency of flavor, but there are other things you mentioned. You see the company you're in, the mood you're in when you're drinking, when you're just enjoying whiskey, not being analytical about it. Some of the finest whiskies that I've whiskey moments, the whiskey's rubbish, but it's very, very, very ordinary whiskey, but but in that moment, it's just the most glorious.
Everything aligns, doesn't it? Your questions are coming thick and fast, and there's one question. There's one from Darren Stott saying, "Can you think of a time you were surprised by a whiskey?"
Oh gosh. Well, to be honest, I think I'm continually surprised. Not every day, by any means, but well, I'll tell you a story which actually follows on from what I was just previously saying. Some years ago, I was invited to go salmon fishing on the Tweed. It was in November. It was bitterly cold, and I went down with a friend from Edinburgh, and we went into a little about 7 o'clock in the morning, a little grocery shop, and bought a bottle of gin and a bottle of Scotch for our host as a thank you. And the only Scotch whiskey they had in the shop was, well, what's called in the trade a secondary blend. I'd never even heard of it, and they're real cheapies, Anyway, it was a bitterly cold day, but clear. There were 6 rods on this beat. Somebody caught a fresh fish, so morale was high. The light went about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We were chilled to the marrow, and we went into the fishing hut, got the old fire going, and the tilly lamps, and broke open this bottle of whiskey, which my host just divided between the 6 big tumblers, and everybody said it was the finest whiskey they'd ever tasted in their lives, and they're putting on their reading specs, saying, "I never heard of this one," and writing it on the back of their checkbooks. Must get some of this. But it was very, very ordinary whiskey. But in the situation, it was the most gorgeous whiskey in the world, in the situation.
I've had a similar experience going to dinner and turning up with some very nice but ordinary wine, and everyone at the dinner starting taking photos of the bottle and posting it on Instagram and saying, brought to us by Isabel. I'm like, no, don't mention me. So there's another question, the antithesis to that. So Ian Sunderland would like to know, are you allowed to confide? What's the worst whiskey or experience?
Oh, that's a good one. Well, there is, I have to say at the start, there is an old saying in Scotland, there's no bad whiskey, there's good whiskey and better whiskey. Now, I have I've tasted some unfortunate whiskies. They're not. Well, I don't like to name names, but some. Yeah, I don't like to name names. It's usually not bottled product. Usually, by the time it's bottled, it's pretty good. But some immature spirit is pretty nasty. And although others, I was doing some tastings last week for Holyrood Distillery, actually in Edinburgh, of new, very, very young whiskey. I'm literally months old, and that you see, by contrast, there was an elegant consistency about it. But the nasty whiskies, yeah, I can't remember now. Well, I can remember a couple, but I'd rather not say.
Fair enough. There's all sorts of rumours and questions going around about what whiskey are you drinking now?
Well, as my friends know, I drink, although malt whiskey is my day-to-day work, I drink blend for when I'm just relaxing like this. And this is a blend, the Adelphi blend, which I've long been a consultant to Adelphi, independent bottler. And Jamie Walker, who set up Adelphi, he borrowed some money from his grandmother to buy his first cask. So he buying casks, and his granny said that she would lend him the money, but on condition he produced a blended Scotch, because she liked drinking blended whiskey. So the Adelphi blend was put together for us by Ian MacLean and Company, and Jamie and I had a say in adjusting. It was an off-the-peg blend, but adjusted, and it suits me very well. It would be described as a premium blend. I get mates rates on the bottle, so it's I don't know what it actually costs at retail, and it's not, you don't see it in the shops, but I drink that, and one I was going to, in fact I might, well, when I finish this glass I'll maybe open the but anyway, so blended Scotch, if I'm buying in the supermarkets, then I would go for, well, Johnny Walker Black Label is my overall favorite. If I really had to only take one whiskey to a desert island, it would be Johnny Walker Black Label. The Black Bottle I like very much. MacLeod's Isle of Skye I like very much. But blended Scotch is my drink for just for pleasure.
And I'm drinking a whiskey that I blended at home, so it's sort of I like to get a light peaty whiskey and blend it with a very heavily
That's a very
sherry
nice
whiskey,
idea.
and get the perfect.
Excuse me. Do you want to start moving through? Yeah. Okay. Well, how long are we going to be, Isabel? Well, we don't know. But...
Well, why don't I give you one last question then, and then we can leave you be. You've done very proud. So I was going to just finish off by asking, and there's, I don't know if you've had a chance to have a look around the show, but there's a bewildering number of brands here at the show. And how important do you think history of whiskey is to them, to the new brands, to the existing brands now? It's a big question, but it's a nice one to finish on.
As I mentioned earlier, the end of the day, it's flavor that will win consumers over. It's going to be extremely difficult for some of the new distilleries to find distributors, and they're selling their product as necessarily as young whiskey. But if you look at the success of Daft Mill, for example, which of course the owners of Daft Mill held on to it for at least 12 years, and so that's not a young whiskey. But the difficulty is, especially in well, anywhere but overseas markets, is the difficulty from the distributor's point of view is persuading the retailers to take this brand new brand and put it on the shelves, because the retailers will say, well, understandably, they say, well, look, wait a minute now, nobody's ever heard of this, and we're going to have to take a bottle off our shelves in order to put your bottle up there. And now, you know, whiskey consumers, we're pluralist, so we will always try. We'll try it once. Will they buy the second bottle? So that's in a nutshell. In terms of the long history of Scotch, I over the last few years, I've been doing a lot of work in China, which of course is a huge target market. I mean, Taiwan is massive, and Taiwan rose to I think it was the 4th biggest market for malt whiskey in the world. It's a small island, and the very, very developed consumer market there. They really appreciate their whiskey, malt whiskey in particular, not blend. And so obviously the whiskey companies want to try and get a little bit of the action in mainland China. And my work is mainly with Diageo in China, not entirely, but mainly. And their approach, which is a very intelligent approach in my view, is through education. But the one thing, to go back to your point, the one thing that the Chinese love is the history. They don't fully understand the history, but the stories, the fact that these brands have been around or the distilleries have been around for centuries or a century or more, means a great deal to them. Means a great deal, and so the history. And that's why Scotch, I think, you see, I mean, an oft asked question is I was doing some research recently that whiskey is now being made in 87 countries in the world. Whiskey. That's all very well. Now, does this imply a threat to Scotch whiskey? The answer is that the Scotch whisky industry shouldn't sit on its hands. They must be aware of this, because some of the whiskies being produced, look at Cavalan in Taiwan. I mean, it's won so many prizes, and it's a gorgeous whiskey. But is it a threat? Well, Scotch still is in a commanding position, and although the industry should take account of and not rest on its laurels, the long history, heritage, the craft skills that have been built up over centuries, if you like, all they add value. You mentioned Nick Morgan. When I remember once going to, I hope Nick won't mind this, and I was going to open this, but I'm going to save it for later. This is the Johnny Walker, the celebratory blend for the 200 years. He said once in a tasting, he was asked, I can't remember now what the question was, but he became very lively, unusually lively for Nick. He said, when you buy a bottle of whiskey, you buy a hell of a lot more than liquor in a bottle. You're buying tradition, you're buying craft, you're buying flavor developed over many years. You know, you're buying the blood of one small nation. Isn't that lovely? So that's why Scotch, I hope, will remain preeminent. But the industry should not sit back and sit on its laurels. But history is very important for I think for the Scotch whisky category.
Thank you, Charlie. You've been amazingly generous with your knowledge and your time. I cannot be grateful enough. The feedback, I've been looking at all the feedback. People are loving it. So thank you so much for your time. So Just as a reminder, we started off with a reading from Charlie's book, published in 2003, I believe. It's well worth trying to pick up a copy. If there's the amount of knowledge that's in this one book is quite astonishing. And any of the questions, I tried to get through as many of the questions as possible. I know there's some I missed off, so if anyone wants to head over to the Whisky.Auction exhibitor stand, we'll try and answer as many of the others as we possibly can. But I think at this stage we need to let Charlie join his sons and enjoy the rest of the evening.
Thanks,
Thank you
Isabel.
so much.
Well, come back to me with any questions that you'd like.
We will. I think we'll have a list. They just keep coming.
God bless you all. Thank you very much indeed. Cheers.
Thank you very much. I'll let you go now. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. I think the best thing to do now is to head over to the Whisky.Auction stand, where I know that Scott and James are looking forward to sharing a dram with you all. Thank you very much. Bye.